This week, we introduced organizational decision making, which will be our focus for the next 3 weeks. And we're going to be looking at various types of organizational decision making, both the use of group methods, the importance of the information system structure of organizations, um, characterizing organizational processes that influence decision making, including power and politics. But this week we took a look at decision making from the standpoint of first understanding individual decision making. And what we talked about were the limitations we began with and tried to understand how it is behaviorally that people make decisions. And we talked about the rational decision model as not really capturing the actual behavior of people making decisions. And we said the complexity of the rational decision model, which is not to say it's not a great model. It's a normative model. You learn a lot about it in business school, and where decision problems are bounded and you can actually get appropriate amounts of information and you have the capacity to process that information, you would use the rational model. But a lot of decision making, especially that are complex decisions that we see in organizations, we said that people do suffer from and have problems with information processing limitations. These limitations are due to cognitive and time constraint. And then also they have to make decisions in the face of uncertain and incomplete information. And this very much describes decision making in organizations. We never have all the information we wish we could have. We have incredibly complex problems that are difficult for any one individual to resolve. One of the reasons we use a lot of group processes is to get a lot of different perspectives and a lot of brains working on a complex problem. And we said that what people are, from a behavioral standpoint, is boundedly rational. They want to make good decisions. They're trying to make the very best possible decision. But in the face of the cognitive limitations, informational limitations, they have to make adjustments. And the adjustments are very sensible. They're very much like the situation with the heuristics that Bazerman describes, is people do it this way because it works. It allows them to make decisions. And so there are a bunch of kind of interesting strategies that characterize the bounded rational model. And all of these involve simplified information gathering and simplified decision procedures. So the approach to making the decision is simplified as well. The first of these we talked about is problem factoring. And we said this is, reference to this is how you learn to do math problems. You break them down into simpler components and steps, and you solve the simple problem and work through the problem factoring to arrive at perhaps a bigger solution. So generally, what people try to do is break problems down into smaller components and solve the smaller components. People engage in localized search. We use the example of the housing search, where people search in neighborhood, usually around a core problem, which is where they work or schools they might have picked or some other factor that defines a locality for them. And then they don't search broadly. They search and try and find a solution around the area in which they have a problem. So this is a notion of localized search. The other thing we talked about is one of the simplifications that people use is they look at one potential solution at a time, and in conjunction with that, they satisfice. So they try and find a satisfactory solution, not an optimal solution. And in the best of circumstances, that can be a short-run solution where they can get feedback on the choice and possibly change their mind. So it's a way of avoiding commitment being locked in. And one of the things we said about this kind of approach to things is it's actually quite fundamental in how organizations think about, for instance, notions of continuous improvement. We have this sense always of we probably have a satisfactory, and we're going to try and make it better. And so embedded in the culture of most organizations and the logic of what people talk about, they don't talk about, well, we made a satisfactory solution, but yes, indeed, they did. And they intend to improve it in the future. That's the whole logic of continuous improvement in organization. And then also that when we have recurring problems, things that come up over and over again, we typically will adopt a standard solution and we stick with it. And the example we used in class was talking about grocery shopping. We typically make a choice once and we tend to stick with it. One of the reasons that people use couponing is not just that the cents off provide an incentive, but coupons make people look and make choices again. And so they're a way to try and break people out of their standard procedure to look at a different tomato sauce or a different condiment because they've got that coupon in their hand. They may not abandon their standard solution, but at least it gets them to think about it. And so very often we see where people have these highly kind of standardized and routinized behavior. They don't think of it as decision making, but it's a fundamental part of decision making. It makes our grocery shopping simple, and it makes decision making in organizations standardized. It makes things efficient and run smoothly. And it's in this standard solutions for standard problems that we see the roots of bureaucracy, because what bureaucracy is the adoption of standard procedures, standard rules, standard ways of making decisions to deal with recurring problems. We also talked about procedural rationality and bureaucracy. This is organizational level decision making. And so the procedural rational model describes an approach to decision making that, again, is procedurally efficient and accounts for the bounded rationality of decision makers, and it includes the same kind of notion of not kind of seeking constantly solutions only when we have a problem. This notion of quasi-resolution of conflict, we talked about how in a complex organization with a division of labor, typically what we don't do is look at and solve the whole system kind of level problem, that we really try and solve it locally, to band-aid it. And the reason for this is that to solve take on bigger problems, to try and come up with a total system solution, creates conflict. You have differences of different interests, differences of opinion, and so procedural rationality says people tend to avoid that. They tend to kind of make little band-aid solutions. They only respond when they have a problem. There's not any kind of proactive decision making. And then also at the core of this is this reliance on standard operating procedures. So we said that organizational decision making invariably has something that is bureaucracy. It's a system of rules and procedures for doing things. It is how you purchase a pencil. It is how you retire equipment. It's how you label equipment, the rules under which you can request equipment. You can get an upgrade in your computer. Those are all things that are done with rules and procedures. And at their most extreme, bureaucracies are these systems of rules and procedures and jobs, and so it's very impersonal. The notion is that the person occupying a particular position is irrelevant. They just need to follow the procedural rationality, follow the rules and procedures. And this is one of the great powers of a bureaucratic organization, is it doesn't matter who is put in the task. They're going to be able to complete the task if they follow the rules and procedures. Highly routinized kind of jobs like this make it very easy to train people. If you think about McDonald's and their high use of mechanization, the mechanization is in fact a set of rules and procedures for doing jobs, and they can plug anybody in there. They can punch a button. They can follow the lights. So we have in any automated system is almost the perfect bureaucracy. So we also talked about how often we complain and gripe about bureaucracy. We think they provide a lot of overhead on our system, but in fact, most of the bureaucracy is of our own making. It is whenever we say we have a problem and we're going to try and resolve it by making a rule, we're creating bureaucracy. And one of the things that we're really going to want to understand as we move forward in other parts of the decision-making topics that we're going to cover are what are some of the options to bureaucracy? What are the ways that leadership can actually intervene in these systems and make them work better, make them more responsive, help them make decisions more quickly. We also talked about among the disadvantages of bureaucracy is how employees respond to them. And they demand a certain kind of formalism. And in that formalism, we see responses where people lose track of the goals. They really are no longer able to kind of think about, does the application of the rule make sense? They just apply the rule, and it's a kind of commitment to the rule where people no longer can kind of stand back and say, does it make sense? They just follow the rule and are unwilling to look at reasons that the rule may not apply. The other part of it is that highly bureaucratic systems have a tendency to induce apathy. Rules can define a minimum standard of behavior, but they can't really specify motivated behavior. And so one of the things that drives us, really crazy about bureaucracy is people will say it's not my job. And so this is really a case of not my job is very, very uncommitted to the performance side. But at the same time, people are committed to the rules. They kind of take on a certain moral authority of their own right. So the bureaucratic system, as we talked about it, is really, if you really think about it, it's a leaderless system. Not only do people not exist, it's just a system of jobs, but leadership is really presumed away, that it's embedded in the rules and regulations and the procedures of the organization. And we actually think leadership matters. We think that leadership actually generates value, that organizations that have strong leadership can actually perform much better than a bureaucratic organization in terms of responsiveness, of innovativeness, being able to kind of customize responses, do new things, are all features that bureaucracy really struggles with. Bureaucracy is highly inertial. They have a hard time making changes. They only make changes, of course, in the face of problems. There's no kind of proactive element. And all the things that we think leadership actually is a value generator. And that's why that we began our discussion of decision making with the notions of bounded rationality, procedural rationality. Those become the baseline in which we're really looking for ways to generate, not other ways to generate value. On the further readings I mentioned here is a book by Herbert Simon, who was the first person to articulate the ideas of bounded rationality in a book called Administrative Behavior. Herb Simon was a psychologist who spent his entire career at Carnegie Mellon University, and he was the very first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize in economics for introducing and starting to talk about what are the actual behavior that individual decision makers engage in, describing this notion of bounded rationality, which also then opened the door to this notion of heuristics and the way that people use rules of thumb, which was for Danny Kahneman, also was a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize, in really elaborating this kind of whole behavioral explanation of decision making and how people deal with fairly complex problems. And in particular, you see in both bodies of literature, trying to understand the way that people deal with these issues of, they can only think about so many things, and also the uncertainty and ambiguity of the information that they're dealing with. In an interesting way, Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, is really a commentary on bureaucracy. And what the Innovator's Dilemma says, Clayton Christensen is a Harvard professor, and he's described situations where established, very, very strong firms have a very hard time innovating, and how they kind of time and again are undermined by small entities that are doing it solving problems not quite as well, but a whole lot cheaper. And one of the kind of the core of why he argues large firms are unresponsive has to do with these kind of bureaucratic investment in the way things have done, this highly inertial component. And what he adds into the notion of procedural rationality is that people are extremely invested in the solutions themselves. Right, so it's very much along the lines of this kind of displacement of goals. Our products and the way we do things have come to have tremendous value to people, and they have a hard time switching away from it. Franz Kafka's The Trial is well-known piece of literature that's describing a person who's caught up in a legal system that completely makes no sense, and that legal system is a bureaucracy, and the person is trying to navigate their way through a set of hidden rules and procedures that don't make much sense. I can't say that it's a great read, run out and grab it, but as a piece of literature, if you've ever been exposed to it, I think you can see the kind of formalism that's there, the kind of people following rules that make no sense. And so in a lot of ways, it's a horror novel about somebody who is caught up in this system and how they're trying to navigate it, kind of bureaucracy. Before Stephen King, Franz Kafka kind of wrote the horror novel about it. Again, I want to be cautious to not just vilify bureaucracy, because every organization is going to have it, and it's extremely important we understand it. And one of the leadership roles is to balance it, to make sure we have the appropriate levels of procedures, we have policies that make sense, we have rules that we can apply for highly routine things we do over and over again. But at the same time, typically what we would like to have is ways of doing the routine, but also ways to invoke exceptions and to come to realize what the real goals are and be able to know when to step away from those routines. And you're only going to have that when you have strong leadership in an organization. There's a leadership presence that is creating in people the kind of culture that they would have where they can recognize an exception, they can do the exceptional in response to an exception. And for most bureaucracies lacking in leadership, there's no decentralization, there's no employee empowerment to do that. So we are going to move on, and in the next few sessions talk about what we think are some kind of different ways to handle decision making. Again, we'll be looking at decision making in complex organizations, which is different than you making investment decisions for your own personal portfolio, because other people are involved. And as we mentioned, we start to get into this domain where there's a separation between decision and implementation, and we're ultimately interested in implementation.